Welcome to Bill's Aviation Podcast, where your stories are our stories. I'm a general aviation pilot, aviation writer, airplane builder, avionics developer, test pilot, and general screw-up. All stories feature Joe and his merry band of miscreants. The purpose of these stories is to educate and entertain pilots. If you have a story you'd like to share anonymously, please contact me. Today's story is titled Friendly Controller. On this beautiful, clear summer day, Joe was taking a long cross-country flight from North Carolina to northern Michigan. Long cross-country trips are always a pleasure. When solo, they can be a bit tedious, even for Joe. To help alleviate the boredom and provide a touch of safety, should something go wrong, upon departing his home airport, Joe contacted Charlotte Departure and requested flight following for his trip over the Appalachian Mountains and the ride north. This is a voluntary service air traffic control may provide upon request, workload allowing. Basically, ATC notifies the pilot of traffic, arranges passage through controlled airspace, etc., if they're not too busy. Also, should the pilot have an issue, ATC already knows who they are and where they are, so they can provide guidance to the nearest airport. Like all ATC communications, it is always courteous and professional. As he often does, Joe had music playing through the headset via the aircraft stereo audio panel. Definitely not the ratty rental planes Joe had been used to flying in the years past. It made Joe appreciate spending 4 years building his airplane. While clicking along at 150 knots, or 175 miles an hour for those who don't speak knots, while burning just under 6 gallons per hour, Joe was enjoying the 3-hour, 35-minute trip north. Clear, smooth air made the trip even more enjoyable. As Joe left the Appalachian Mountains behind, he looked ahead to strategize about going under, through, or over the Detroit Class Bravo controlled airspace, which loomed up ahead like a massive upside-down wedding cake. Joe knew ATC was unlikely to let him go south to north through the Detroit Bravo, so it was either divert west to avoid it, descend down and go underneath it and deal with all the smaller Class Delta airports that were sprinkled down there, or climb above the Detroit Bravo and continue on straight. After a few simple calculations, Joe decided to go over the top and avoid the Detroit Bravo altogether. The decision was easy to make since he was already cruising along at 8,500 feet and only had to climb to 10,500 to go over the top. As Mid-Ohio approached, Joe notified ATC he was out of 8,500 for 10.5, and 4 minutes later, Joe was comfortably cruising along at his higher altitude. He could see across Lake Erie and into Canada. Approaching the Detroit Metroplex, aka Detroit Metro, Joe was handed off to the Detroit Approach controllers. Checking in with the Detroit Approach, Joe keyed up the mic and broadcast, "Detroit Approach, experimental 1 Whiskey Romeo, level at 10.5. The Detroit controller replied with the usual, "Detroit altimeter 3002, remain clear of the Bravo, blah 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 blah." Before Joe could confirm the transmission, a different controller asked, "November 1 Whiskey Romeo? Are you in an RV-9er Alpha or an RV-9er? Joe replied, "Negative on the Alpha. With a question like that, you must be a builder." Keep in mind that this is a very busy airspace with a lot of traffic on the frequency. The controller replied, "Negative on the RV, building a Cozy Mark IV. The controller made a comment about Joe's airplane being a real airplane because it was a tailwheel. The two exchanged a few more words before they wished each other a good day and got back to work. 2 years later, Joe was back in Charlotte and received a call from one of his fellow EAA chapter members and a friend. Apparently, a new guy had just retired and bought a house in North Charlotte, not far from Joe's place, and he needed help unloading some stuff. Always eager to see some stuff, Joe arrived at the new guy's house, ready to help him unload the stuff, which turned out to be a partially completed Cozy Mark IV. As the new guy and Joe started exchanging pleasantry, Joe found out that he was a retired air traffic controller who had moved down from the Detroit area. Alarm bells went off in Joe's head. He mentioned the exchange to the new guy, and sure enough, it was the new guy Joe had spoken with a few years back. To this day, 12 plus years later, they both recall the exchange and laugh about it. Lesson learned when talking to air traffic control, always be professional and courteous, not just because it makes a difficult job a little bit easier, but you never know when you might meet one of them in person and become friends. New guy, it has been good getting to know you. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please hit the like button or thumbs up and subscribe by clicking on the logo in the lower right of your screen. If you really like what you've heard, please help support this channel and become a Patreon. Part of each donation will go to aviation safety and aviation youth programs. Be sure to check out next week's story about Joe and Bob taking a 172 from the Detroit metro area to Burlington, Vermont, and discovering a leak in upstate New York.